Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Closing the Gap Between Subscription Content and Open Access Content, which is sponsored by Alexander Street, a ProQuest company. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you will see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the buttons labeled Chat and Q&A in the upper right corner of the screen to activate the panels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. At the end of the presentation, they will take a few minutes to answer your questions, so please do send them in throughout. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat panel to let me know, and I'll troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRLChoiceWebinars, so if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right, our presenters today are Andrea Vorio and Jenna Mikowski. Andrea is the creator and director of the Open Music Library Initiative at Alexander Street, and Jenna is a senior editor at Alexander Street. At this point, we're ready to get started, so I'll pull up the deck and hand the floor over to you, Andre.
Thank you very much, Mark. All right. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Andrea Vorio. I'm the head of the Open Music Library Initiative at Alexander Street. And very soon, as Mark said, you'll also be hearing from my colleague, Jenna Mikowski, who is the senior editor of Anthropology. In this webinar, we'll argue that following the growth of open access in recent years, a gap between open and paid resources has emerged in academic publishing. We believe that this segregation of content is indeed counterproductive to finding and accessing the most relevant resources for research, and today we'll share with you all the why and how. To close the gap, we have been working together with libraries and archives to explore new methods of integrating open access and subscription content that enable scholars and students to have a much richer and comprehensive view of their disciplines. In the next hour, Jen and I will share with you details of two projects we have been involved with, the Open Music Library and the Anthropology Commons. They were both built to bring the best integration, access, and discoverability to the digital content that matters most within their respective discipline communities, music and anthropology, regardless of content being open access or paid. The idea we put forward today is that we can close that gap separating open access from paid resources by focusing on discipline communities and collaboration, moving academic publishing to an integrated view of a discipline. I'd like to begin by briefly touching on the growth of open access in recent years. Let me just make sure I can control the deck. Oh, there it is. Oops. Right. So since 2002, which was then the Budapest Open Access Initiative articulated the principles of the open access movement, thousands of journals have adopted or maybe modified policies, enabling them to disseminate knowledge openly and freely. And many new publications that were created recently already started open. To give you some numbers, according to the director of open access journals, there are over 10,000 academic publications currently available for free, a number which has more than doubled over the last decade. But one result of this explosive growth of the open access movement has been the emergence of a schism between free and paid content. Publishers that have embraced both modes of access tend toward a separate presentation of their content. Wiley and Springer Nature, for example, which are two of the largest publishing players in the academic space, have built separate websites for their open access journals. They're called Wiley Open Access and Springer Open. But whether this presentation choice has instigated or reflects the existing open versus closed segregation in academic publishing, well, in either case, it becomes counterproductive when, at the end of the day, the goal of a researcher is simply to access all the relevant data and knowledge they need to do their work. Today, I want to show you that open access is not only a challenge to the whole academic publishing sector, but much more importantly, it is also a very fruitful ground for innovation and collaboration between publishers and libraries towards one common goal: access to the world's knowledge. At Alexander Street, our focus has been on disciplines and the specific needs of our end users, which are librarians, researchers, teachers, and students. Where other publishers license or publish and then aggregate and distribute, at Alexander Street, we curate multimedia content into discipline-specific or interdisciplinary collections. That is because music students, for example, have research needs that are significantly different to the needs of a psychology student. And that is why, as you'll see in today's webinar, our approach in music was different to our approach in anthropology. But in most cases, our collections are created for the scholar or the researcher, but many of them also have a specific classroom focus. That is often the case with our video collections, for example. But in any case, the aim is certainly to bring the best organization, access, and discoverability to the content that matters most within an academic discipline. We then enhance the value of that content that we curate through what we call semantic indexing, which, put very simply, consists of enriching all that content with detailed metadata that allows us to put together a really rich research experience. Over the past many years, we have carefully crafted and maintained several control vocabularies, which are the backbone of our platform. This is exactly what enables us to present a video performance of an opera, for example, and then music scores of that same musical work side by side. Or perhaps similar operas by the same composer or from the same time period. These control vocabularies are at the core of the user experience afforded by our platform today. And although Alexander Street is rooted in a commercial publisher's framework, with subscription paywalls created for the purpose of generating royalties for content providers as well as content creators, we have also been very close to and supportive of the open access movement for two key reasons. First, our multimedia collections are highly curated and contain previously unpublished archival materials. In the archive space, the mission-driven end goal is nearly always to maximize access to content. And as third-party digitizers and publishers of such content, we have engaged in conversations with many archives around the world about how to cooperate and support their open missions. And secondly, we specialize in discipline-specific publishing in the humanities and social sciences. Both in music and anthropology, which are two of our key disciplines, openly licensed content has grown substantially over the last decade, as I will show in just a moment. Well, ultimately, when the goal is to help scholars and students to discover and use content relevant to their research, scholarship cannot be restricted to content that is freely available or indeed to content that only exists behind a paywall. Scholars need systems and tools that allow them to discover and use both at the same time. But that being said, the profile of music rights is a strange combination, especially for classical music. On one hand, the major labels are highly protective of the rights they hold for major performances. It's highly unlikely that they will make the bulk of their content free anytime in the future. But on the other hand, there is a lot of excellent content relevant to the study of music that has already been digitized and made available in the public domain. This includes original manuscripts of scores, for example, but also older music journals, libretti, concert programs, images, and many other ephemera. But it's not just the old stuff as well. There's also a lot of recent content published openly on the web, in open access journals and open monographs, but also by contemporary composers and artists and performers themselves who choose open content licenses, such as Creative Commons, to release their works. The growth of open access is pretty tangible and spans across many disciplines, as I'm sure many of you here today know. However, what I find most exciting is that open access is part of a much larger global social movement that touches on so much more than the issue of access to expensive journals. It includes culture and access to knowledge at large. In the last issue of the State of the Commons report, which is released every year by the Creative Commons organization, they point out that in 2016, the total number of works licensed with one of the Creative Commons licenses has passed the 1.2 billion mark. That number has in fact nearly tripled in the last 5 years. About 65% of Creative Commons works are shared under what is known as free culture licenses, which are the ones that are more permissive regarding the use that can be made of the work, like the CC BY licensed, which only requires attribution of the author of the work, or the CC0, which is used for public domain works. Oh, by the way, speaking of public domain, the public domain works more than doubled in size in 2016, reaching the 92 million mark. That is a very low estimate, of course, as there are many works in the public domain that reach the web one way or another without ever receiving a specific license. Well, given the multimedia nature of the web and all the different open platforms that exist out there, all that content licensed with Creative Commons come in a variety of formats: videos, images, research papers, and of course, they exist in a variety of platforms too. Today, there are over 35 million videos with Creative Commons licenses on YouTube and Vimeo. Wikipedia, for example, has over 42 million articles available to everyone. There are also Jamendo and the FMA, or the Free Music Archive, which are two music-specific sites which combined offer over 500,000 tracks of both contemporary and classical music for free. But well, cultural heritage organizations have also embraced the web and are taking an active role in publishing digital content too. And they're often doing so also using one of those free culture or open content licenses. Gallica at the National Library of France is a fabulous example of an open access archive with thousands of digitized content made available for free. The Digital Library of Spain is another similar example with a ton of materials of interest to researchers. But specifically music, the New York Philharmonic Digital Archives is another very interesting one. There you can find digital copies of scores that have been annotated by conductors who performed at the New York Phil. Here's an example of a score of the Italian opera La Bohème, which was annotated by Leonard Bernstein himself. These are incredibly valuable resources for musicologists. The problem is, how are we going to find the good stuff? Well, music is dealt quite poorly by generic search engines like Google and other discovery services. Quality content from reputable archives like the ones I've just shown are often buried at the end of search results. Not only that, but distinguishing materials about Mozart from those by Mozart isn't always easy. Well, some interesting initiatives have emerged, such as Europeana, DPLA, or the Digital Public Library of America, and a few others, but they do not solve the specific problems that music researchers and librarians have. You will find over 27 million records in Europeana today, but there's no way to see only the music scores. And even if you found a score, it's not straightforward to then find audio recordings of that same musical work that was represented in the score that you happen to be writing a paper about? Well, but most importantly, for many libraries and cultural heritage organizations, the mission of disseminating knowledge is only half complete if their content is not easily found and used. And as the content on the web grows in volume, this problem is only likely to get worse. Given that the field of academic music has a great deal of free and paid content, what if we applied our expertise with semantic indexing and expanded it to cover not only our for-fee content, but all the quality open access content available on the web as well? This would solve another fairly common problem that music researchers encounter when dealing with these archives, which is not knowing where exactly to look. Take the composer Chopin, for example. Some of his original manuscripts are at the National Library of France, but many others are found at the Polish National Library. Wouldn't it be great to use one search engine to find them all? Well, we seem to have two challenges here. One is that we have to come up with sustainable ways by which publishers, archives, and libraries can collaborate to get the large amount of yet-to-be digitized content out on the open web. And in order to make the most of all the incredible amount of work we put into digitization projects, we need to find ways to allow scholars and students to discover and use content that is free and paid at the same time. These challenges have been framed based on our understanding that not all content will be free, but more importantly, that scholarship cannot be restricted to content that is freely available or to content that only exists behind a paywall. Instead, in favor of comprehensiveness, we would like to see an integration of both worlds into free and collaborative indices and tools that serve the academic community. It is precisely in this context that the Open Music Library project was born just over a year ago. The website is live, and you can check it out now at openmusiclibrary.org. But before jumping into how it works, I wanted to explain the context just a little further. As many of you already know, Alexander Street publishes several music databases. They are available to libraries as an annual subscription or perpetual license. A leading series is our Classical Scores Library, which is the largest database of in-copyright scores available today, with over 50,000 titles and over 1 million pages of notated music. On our platform, a user can study in-copyright scores alongside relevant licensed videos, audio recordings, and books, but it doesn't serve the scholar to omit openly available digitized resources, such as manuscripts, open access articles, or even relevant performances available for free on YouTube. Rooted in cornerstone pillars of the open access movement, that is, access to knowledge and community and collaboration, the OML has been designed as a creative solution to existing OA and paid content schism we talked about. The same technologies we use in Alexander Street's for-fee platform have been applied to both paid and open access content sets. Our semantic indexing I talked about, and our carefully curated control vocabularies. Rather than further segregating OA content in different platforms, these initiatives bring the two worlds together, creating a seamless research experience. We wanted to see the same level of user experience afforded by our paid platform available to all open access digital content relevant to music researchers. And we wanted it to be multimedia from day one. That's why we started with journal articles and then scores from the world's best digital collections, but we have already evolved the OML to include video performances, and of course, both open access and paid titles that we licensed, and just released last week audio recordings as well. The mission of the OML is to create one space for music researchers to find the most music resources available online. And this, indeed, can only be achieved by including both open access and for-fee resources in one platform, and not perpetuating that gap. That is why the OML indexes Alexander Street's for-fee music collections, as well as a multitude of scholarly resources openly available on the web. from other publishers, cultural heritage archives, libraries, and several universities around the world. Here's an example of how all that content, open access and subscription, come together in one place, in this case around an Italian opera. Scores from our for fee platform appear alongside scores published and made available openly by national libraries. The same thing happens for videos. Our pay titles appear alongside relevant YouTube performances which have been published by opera houses, orchestras, universities, etc. The digital collections of music scores from several national libraries have been already indexed in the OML, including the National Library of France, Spain, Brazil, Colombia, the Library of Congress, and a few others. We have a great coverage of classical music now, including the works of many contemporary composers. In fact, looking back, we have gone from about 50,000 items in our for fee collection of scores to over 200,000 scores now. That is 4 times the size of the collection we had last year before we started the OML. And the good news is that 75% or over 75% of that is open access. Of course, these items are all cross-searchable and have been neatly integrated, which means that there is no other site out there enabling a music researcher to find today in the same place the manuscript of Arnold Schoenberg's Serenade, for example, which is available openly on the website of the Library of Congress, which is of course open access, alongside a published in copyright edition of that same work, which requires a paid subscription. Oh, and an article written by Schoenberg himself, which was reprinted in a 2001 issue of American Music Teacher, which, by the way, has a preprint that is also open access. Or to mention another example, the published work of a musical work by Aaron Copland, which is in copyright and requires a paid subscription, next to a series of his own sketches that have led him to the final published work. These have been digitized and made available for free online by national libraries. What is open access stays freely accessible. What is for fee stays behind a paywall. But they can both be discovered in the same place in the context of research on a particular musical work or of a composer. You can find all of that and much more in Copland's profile page in the OML. And in fact, we have taken a community-centered approach here, and people like Copland and other composers and musicologists are the central nodes of the OML. Profiles of composers, musicologists, performers, arrangers, and many others have been already created, effectively forming a research hub and a social graph of people such as Schoenberg and Copland. The OML is an open network, which means that everyone is not only able to freely access its index, but also to build upon it or expand it. So when someone signs up, that person becomes part of this academic music network too. A composition professor may find that a hub has already been formed with all of their publications, book reviews, and scores based on the content that we have already indexed ourselves, open access and subscription, of course. But that same composition professor or other researchers may choose to contribute preprints or indeed new materials that might not have been already being indexed, effectively expanding this free index. Collaboration networks also emerge from these various links, as you can imagine, allowing researchers to identify, for example, when and in which works Erik Satie and Debussy, 2 French composers, collaborated or influenced one another. Speaking of making connections, we know that with increased coordination between librarians and technologists, diffusion of open source software and metadata standards, contributing to the web today is both easy and fairly inexpensive. But how do we go from making content available to harnessing the web's most powerful feature, links, to connect and make related content more discoverable? Well, in addition to making scholarly content more accessible, the OML also promotes the exposure of related items from a variety of collections. This benefits contributors of content that may not have been otherwise found, like, for example, a niche collection of Baroque music, which has been digitized and put together by a small music library, as well as librarians hoping to promote high-quality resources to which they devote their funds. In the OML, each learning or research object, such as a musical work, an instrument, a specific score, a time period, a composer, or indeed a very specific performance, has a permanent, unique identifier, giving everyone a simple way to find related materials. So, for example, tagging or associating a journal article about Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 with that musical works identifier in the OML links that article to all the associated scores, videos, and audio performances, and all the other articles that refer to the same symphony. And as new content is added to the OML, that identifier gets more and more and more comprehensive over time. An OML user can also save their research items to a list, share it with their peers, and follow certain objects to receive notifications when a relevant item is added, such as when a manuscript is digitized and added to the index, like the work by Shostakovich that was discovered just 2 days ago at the Moscow State Archives, or hopefully something more frequent, like when a new issue of a journal is published. As I'm sure you'll all appreciate, integrating and linking digital collections from such a variety of sources requires a tremendous amount of metadata alignment. Multiple languages, alternative spellings, just to name a few, make it fairly difficult to establish meaningful connections between disparate collections. But we've made great progress already in the OML, and we can achieve much more with further collaboration and openness. We have addressed many of these technical challenges at Alexander Street by creating control vocabularies and technologies over the last 15 years as part of our multimedia databases. The good news is that the very same technologies and data that allowed us to build award-winning products and establish semantic links between multimedia content served as the initial foundation of the OML. As such, these control vocabularies and all of our metadata have been made open so that everybody may align their collections to them and reduce the need to reinvent taxonomies with each new resource that is created. Using the online tools already available for free on the OML's website, it literally takes a few seconds to add a YouTube video performance to a musical work page. And then from there, to create a list with that same video and a couple of scores that you can share with your peers, your students, and even colleagues in the discipline. We believe that it is this integration of paid and free content, all in one place and contextualized by a disciplined community, that will help us close the gap between access modes in music. This enables researchers to discover and use open and subscription content because one doesn't exclude the other. They often complement each other. The end result is a bird's-eye view of the music research landscape. With the OML, our fairly ambitious aim is not only to advance the state-of-the-art in music knowledge discovery, but also to increase opportunities for creative reuse, research, and collaboration with the academic music community. I invite all of you to get to know the Open Music Library by visiting the website at openmusiclibrary.org, and I look forward to hearing what you think. I will now pass the word to my dear colleague, Jenna Makovsky, who will tell you more about the Anthropology Commons and how this academic discipline community approach translates to anthropology. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andre. So as Andre has just demonstrated with the Open Music Library, At Alexander Street, we see open access as a fruitful grounds for collaboration and for open communication between publishers and libraries, because at the end of the day, we're really working towards the same common goal, which is making content available for knowledge dissemination and for broader scholarly integration and research. So at Alexander Street, I'm responsible for curating and managing the anthropology portfolio. As a publisher and as a content provider, Alexander Street focuses on a number of different disciplines, with music and anthropology being two of the key disciplines that we work on. Oftentimes, the content needs within disciplines are the same, but sometimes they can vary, and we tune into those variations in our different publishing and presentation models. So when it comes to music and anthropology, for example, there are some broad similarities. For example, just like in music, there are copyright restrictions in anthropology, meaning that we can't simply make all content open and free. But at the same time, there's a general desire within the discipline to maximize the amount of content that can be made freely available. And more broadly, when we treat anthropology from this broader community or discipline perspective, as a community of scholars and a community of content, we can create a unifying space in which we bring together all of the most important content within the discipline, both free and paid, into the same space, integrated in a cross-search environment and accessible to the scholars and researchers who need it. So in this segment of the presentation, I'm going to talk about a project that we launched about a year ago called the Anthropology Commons, which is an open archive initiative that we developed to address this broader topic we've been speaking about regarding the need to bridge open and paid materials. And in this case, it's through the lens of an archive-specific publishing project in an archive-specific framework. So in anthropology, one of the key content types that we publish are archives and manuscripts. And this is specifically in the genre of fieldwork and ethnographic materials. The way research is conducted in anthropology is largely through fieldwork, which is a unique type of qualitative research, unique methodology, in that scholars will go and live in the community for a number of years, collecting qualitative data and observations about the culture, the place, and the society. They'll eventually use all of these raw primary sources then to publish a final work or a final ethnography. But when it comes to the original primary sources, when it comes to decisions about making these rich materials available, there are often very specific needs. These might range from differing access philosophies, sometimes between the archives that eventually come to hold the materials and the literary estates which hold the copyright. And as another example, we often run into culturally sensitive concerns regarding the community of origin that the research was conducted in, and there are often more complicated questions around what's appropriate to make available, what's not. And so in order to address these content-specific needs and to respond to the desire to bridge open and paid materials, we did two things in the archive space around this anthropology project. First, behind the scenes, we integrated a couple of different publishing models that range from royalty-bearing to open, with the open model supported by our subscription models as a way to drive sustainable funding for digitizing and publishing open content. And second, on Front Stage, we integrated open archive content that we published on our platform with paid collections. So from a researcher's perspective or from the end user's perspective, this enables an integrated search experience across metadata. So these two things, integrating open and paid publishing models and integrating open and paid content, are at the heart of the Anthropology Commons, which currently has about 10,000 pages of open primary sources, which are cross-searchable with 200,000 pages of paid primary sources under this broader umbrella of historic archival fieldwork. And all of these are further cross-searchable with the video, audio, and secondary texts that we have curated within the broader discipline of the anthropology community. So before I get into the specifics of the Anthropology Commons, I'll start with just a brief introduction to the anthropology collections that we publish at Alexander Street. So who is Alexander Street Anthropology? We curate and we publish comprehensive multimedia collections for the study of anthropology. This includes the largest collection of ethnographic film or visual anthropologies in the world, with over 2,200 hours of ethnographic documentaries and growing. And we're also a major publisher of archival collections, including the original papers and field work of some of the most important foundational scholars in the field. For example, we've published Margaret Mead's original fieldwork from Samoa, Bronislaw Malinowski's original fieldwork from the Trobriand Islands, Victor Turner's original fieldwork from Zambia. All of these original primary sources eventually led to some of the theories and methodologies that are still used by anthropologists when they're conducting their own research today. All of this content is available then on our cross multimedia platform and is all deeply indexed using the same controlled vocabularies and indexing terms. When it comes to the topic of open access within the discipline of anthropology more broadly, open access is a pretty central area of discussion. And this is particularly true in the journal publishing space. For example, in 2013, the journal Cultural Anthropology, which is one of the flagship journals of the American Anthropological Association, went completely open, perhaps rocking the boat with Wiley, who's been publishing AAA journals behind a paywall for about a decade. Additionally, within the research space, which is characterized by relationships between scholars and the communities that they work with, there is often a dialogue about shared access to the fieldwork that's collected. Oftentimes, fieldwork is done in a participatory and collaborative way, and a lot of the data that's collected is culturally significant to the community for its linguistic, historic, or cultural richness. And so there's a big desire and a need to make this material open. And when it comes to historic collections of field materials, many of the archives that hold these collections are beginning to digitize them and make them available. For example, the British Library, for example, has embarked on a major digitization initiative in the world music space, making dozens of ethnographic music recordings available in an open access environment. And because of our position in the publishing space, with our royalty models, our rich indexing and technology, and an open platform and open metadata, we're well positioned to think creatively about sustainable open access solutions for archives, which is one of our major focuses. So as I've mentioned, archival publishing is a key part of our anthropology content, particularly because archives around the world serve as the protectors and preservers of thousands of ethnographic collections and fieldwork, which document and preserve the richness and diversity of human behavior and human culture around the world. When an archive wants to digitize its content and publish it openly, short of having internal funds to support itself, which as many of you who probably work in institutions are well aware is usually not the case, there are usually three major models for funding OA content. It might be funded, for example, by a for-profit organization as a community service or as a marketing initiative, which is the case with the project Accessible Archives, if anyone is familiar with that. On the flip side, it might be funded by a nonprofit organization, in which case there may be limited funding and often slow-moving goals. There are other models as well. For example, the organization Reveal Digital, which is essentially a threshold model. Once the funds have been crowdsourced, the content is digitized and made open. But in this case, publishing is at the mercy of the speed with which the funds may or may not be raised. And so this is just a little taste of the broader landscape that we're looking at when it comes to publishing archives. The other challenge, which I alluded to earlier, is that archives have varied and diverse missions, and the content itself may have varied needs, which means that some content is more appropriate for free access and some is not, which brings us back to the schism at the heart of this presentation between paid and free content. And this is something that I discovered as I began dialogues with the archives that hold these key ethnographic fieldwork collections. So in many cases, when it comes to historic ethnographic fieldwork, the archive itself will hold the content, like the physical content, but not the rights. The estate or the literary executor, or sometimes the scholars themselves or their families, often hold the rights. In some cases, the archive and the estate goals may align, and both want the materials published in a royalty-bearing space. In other cases, though, one party may want royalties and the other one may want open access. In other cases still, the nature of the content can dictate whether open publishing is appropriate or not. And in yet other cases, all parties involved may want the content to be open but have no funding mechanism to make that happen. And so we took all of these varied scenarios, along with the understanding that the researcher on the other end just wants a unified access and search and discovery experience, and we created the Anthropology Commons project. And so the engine driving this project is really behind the scenes, with the integration of a couple of different publishing models and the connection of the open content with our paid subscription collections. We've essentially created 3 different models, and we've integrated them to drive the publication of open archival materials. The first publishing model, which you'll see at the top there, is our traditional royalty-bearing model, where we digitize the content, place it into a collection, paywall collection, in this case our anthropological fieldwork collection, and royalties are generated back to the rights holders via subscriptions. So this model is appropriate for some cases. In some cases, archives may wish to generate a little bit of revenue for their mission-driven needs. And it also works in cases where there might be ethical factors that dictate the need for royalties. In the anthropology space, we found this to be especially true for ethnomusicology fieldwork. As an example, we recently published the Mark Slobin archive. Mark Slobin is an ethnomusicologist who did fieldwork in Afghanistan in the 1960s. And that first image there that you see in the upper right-hand corner is from his fieldwork. He traveled around the country recording music performances with the goal of documenting the great musical and cultural diversity of the region, which has since seen complete disruption with the Soviet and American occupations and the takeover of the Taliban, which has all happened after his research was done. When Mark decided last year that he wanted to publish his fieldwork, he felt that it was ethical and right to acknowledge the performers with royalties. But unfortunately, many of those that he recorded are no longer with us, or he's lost contact with them. And so he chose the royalty-bearing model, and we are sending the royalties accrued to a nonprofit organization in Kabul, which is dedicated to reestablishing music programs within the school system there. And so I use this as an example just to demonstrate that, though complicated, sometimes royalties are necessary and useful. The second publishing pathway in the middle of the slide is what we call our hybrid or our delayed model. In these cases, we support the cost of digitizing and put the content into an embargo period. This allows us to recoup our costs and generate some royalties for the rights holders. And it's worked particularly well in cases where we have to find a compromise between an archive and an estate. We can generate royalties for a period of time for the rights holders, but ultimately the content becomes open access at the end of the period, so it's on an open access track. For researchers and for librarians, we're able to support making the content available much more quickly than if it were in an institutional digitization queue, which for some content may mean it could be decades before it's digitized, or maybe even never. We've used this model in particular to publish the Bronislaw Malinowski papers, which is, there's an image there from his fieldwork. He did fieldwork in the Pacific at the turn of the century. And this was a great successful compromise between the archive and the estate, in that we were able to kind of meet the needs of both parties involved when there were competing interests between royalties and open access. The third publishing pathway at the bottom of the slide there is our open access model. And this is for archives and content where the need is open publication immediately. And in this case, we're setting aside 10% of the paid collection sales from the first model, the subscription model, into a pool to fund the publication of OA content. So essentially, using our subscription models to simultaneously support open access. And we've used these integrated publishing models to publish our first open access archive, the Ruth Benedict papers, in collaboration with the Vassar College Archive. So Ruth Benedict was a prominent anthropologist who conducted research in the American Southwest in the 1920s and 30s. We have nearly 10,000 pages of previously unpublished materials that are now available from her archive on our platform. And it's been with the integration of these 3 publishing models that's enabled us to create a sustainable funding mechanism for publishing open access content, with our subscription collections essentially supporting open content. And it's been successful with archives because it allows us to center dialogues around the needs of the content and the needs of the institution at the forefront. And so this has been one of the solutions that we've been working with on the archive end. But when it comes to the researcher's goal, the ultimate goal is just a unified search experience across all of this content. And so in this case, in order to respond to this need, we've integrated the open content with our paid content on our platform, such that all of the metadata and all of the content itself is cross-searchable. So as an example, just to demonstrate how this looks in action. So Ruth Benedict, though she was known as a very capable anthropologist in her own right, is perhaps even better known for her role as Margaret Mead's teacher. We have Margaret Mead's papers and fieldwork published on our platform as well, but this content is in our hybrid model. So due to a number of factors, including the sheer size of the archive and the combined needs of her literary estate and the holding institution, her papers are in our subscription collection for an embargo period. But in the meantime, we've made the metadata open so that a researcher can cross-search Mead and Benedict. We've used the same indexing terms, the same deep search control vocabularies for all of this content. And in this way, we're able to bring these two important content sets together. This means that researchers can make new discoveries about the evolution of theoretical frameworks and methodologies across two generations of important anthropological scholarship. As for the future of the Anthropology Commons, this is the beginning, and we intend to publish more content with this Open Archive initiative. And if you have any suggestions or ideas for collections that you'd like to see published, please get in touch. My email is here. And so in conclusion, the Anthropology Commons and the Open Music Library seek to eliminate the schism that currently exists between open and paid content. By bringing together these types of content through a unified search experience, scholars are able to discover and use the most relevant digital resources in their disciplines. The content-centered approach of the Anthropology Commons led to the creation of open publishing solutions for archives that meet varied needs and missions, both for the archive and for the content itself. The community-focused approach of the Open Music Library enables music researchers around the world to make previously unrelated connections between disparate and siloed materials and fosters scholarly collaboration. Despite these initiatives, though, there's always more work to be done when it comes to content and knowledge dissemination. We hope these initiatives can serve as templates or fodder for new creative approaches to bridging the schism between access models across academic publishing. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jenna, and thank you, Andre, as well. This is Mark from ACRL and Choice. We've got some time here at the end, I think, for some questions, and we've had a few come through the Q&A module. So if you do have questions for either Andre or Jenna, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A module now, and we'll get started with some of those that we have here.
Thank you very much, Mark. I have received a couple of questions already. So Alexandra Humphreys just asked, are you mainly interested in classical music and scores? What about traditional folk music and other types of music which are not copyrighted? Well, thank you very much for that question, first of all. We are interested in much more than just classical music. And in fact, even though that is, I suppose, the largest subset of scores that we have in the OML, we also have a lot of digital lyrics and songbooks and many other things. In journal articles, we have a similar scenario. Most of the journals cover such a broad range of topics in musicology. It's not just classical music. We have a lot of journals focused on contemporary works, on computer science and music, etc., etc., etc. But if you have a digital collection that is open access at your institution, or if you're responsible for a digital collection, please do get in touch and let's talk about how we could integrate them in the OML. That would be great. Thank you for the question, Alexandra.
Great, and I think we've got another question here that came in, perhaps for you, Andre, as well.
Michelle,
yes. Yeah.
I see one here from Michelle. Michelle Oberg, thank you for the question. It looks like there is not an advanced search option available at this time, I assume, in the Open Music Library. Is that part of the plan for the UI, for the user interface? That is a great question. So we made an arbitrary choice to simplify the user interface to the maximum. And we stripped down all the facets, or most of the facets that we have in our paid platform, because we wanted to investigate quite deeply what resonates with students and researchers the most and what really doesn't. So we are running several experiments in the Open Music Library and learning from the way users engage with our search engine. It is very simple at this time, but it does recognize some interesting queries. Like if you're trying to compile a list of women French composers, you can just type exactly that in the search box and you will get meaningful results. So we're trying to make the OML search engine as friendly as we possibly can without overwhelming users with a ton of choices and a ton of drop downs to navigate. So that's been our approach to search. That being said, I do recognize that a lot of people are asking for an advanced search option. So it's not that we are not going to do this, but we have prioritized all of those natural language experiments. And yes, an advanced search is in the roadmap. It's not something that we have been able to complete at this point, but it will come at some point. But that being said, I hope that the natural language search approach is one that resonates with you as well. But if not, please let me know. Send me some feedback. I would love to hear more details. And Mark, I think you were referring to a question from Rebecca, which reads, are you considering an open dance library? I love that question because indeed we have a lot of for-fee dance content in our collections. And we have indexed the classical performance in video, which is a collection of, I think, 2,300 titles. And they include a bunch of dance works. So in fact, you can find a lot of dance works in the OML already today. But no, we haven't considered yet a specific ODL or open dance library. But thank you for the question, Rebecca.
Great, and I think we've got a question here that I think came through for Jenna as well during her towards the end of her presentation from Stephen. And Stephen asks, how much OA content is in the public domain? Is much of the content that's coming through on the anthropology side in the public domain, or is it much of it stuff that's being sort of released OA initially? Could you
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. When it comes to this particular type of content that we're working with in anthropology, which is fieldwork, the question of public domain largely revolves around the scholar's lifespan. And so it really just depends. I think it's typically about 75 years for unpublished materials. So for example, Ruth Benedict is not in the public domain yet. I think it will be in a couple of years. But in addition to the question of being in the public domain, there's also the question of putting it on a track towards digitizing it and making it available. So there's sort of two sides to that question. But sometimes it is in the public domain. It's literally a case-by-case basis depending on, because it's largely unpublished primary sources, and so it's depends on the scholar, him or herself.
Great, yeah.
Mark, there's
very interesting. Yeah, please go ahead.
There's a great question here from Jessica Grimm, and Jenna, this is a question that touches on a point you made earlier. She says, maybe I missed it, but I didn't see the OA subscription percentages in OML. Is it like the Anthropology Commons with 80% public domain and only 20% some form of OA? And Jen, I think it would be useful here to explain that split in the Anthropology Commons, because it's a slightly different thing for the OML, right?
Sure. So the Anthropology Commons is simply it's a project that we're using to make content open and available using funding from the revenue that we get from some of our other subscription collections. And so the Anthropology Commons is sort of a standalone project, and it's essentially, consider it sort of like a mechanism or a project by which we're making content open. So I wouldn't think of it in terms of like part of a paid subscription collection. It's sort of a standalone type of project.
Right, whereas in the OML, the split that I mentioned in scores, which was 75% open access and 25% for fee, applies to scores only. The distribution is very different when you look at, for example, papers and journal articles. There are many more subscription or paid articles about music than there are open access ones. So I believe in the OML currently we have under 100 journals that are open access and have been indexed, and about 500 that are subscription. So the ratio for journals is very heavy on the paid content, but the ratio on scores is very heavy on open access content. As I said, 75 versus 25. Tom also just asked a question that I wanted to address. He said, Tom Christie, he said, it looks like you're using many linked data principles in both platforms. Will your metadata be made open to help leverage all of the other projects like this? And the answer is a big yes. We are, and we have indeed we have used several principles of the semantic web to build the Open Music Library. And in building the Open Music Library, we are already opening up our metadata, certainly around musical works and composers, etc. And all of those links are available to anyone interested in building or linking their collections to the Open Music Library. I have been in conversations with several librarians from all over the world who are adopting linked data and have an interest in linking to the OML. So we have explored options around things like performance data. So a lot of opera houses and concert venues are opening up their performance data to scholars and researchers. And it would be fantastic if from very early on, we could link those huge data sets with identifiers that would allow someone to ask, basic but very complex queries like, how many times has this opera or this specific concerto by Mozart being performed in New York City? So by linking those huge data sets, we can start answering those questions programmatically, and that is in the vision of the OML.
Great.
Dale, do we have time for a couple more, Mark?
We've got a little time. Yeah, for sure.
Dale just asked, how do your projects handle non-Roman, particularly right-to-left content? Jenna, would you like to answer that regarding anthropology?
Well, a lot of, in anthropology specifically, a lot of the content that we're working with is handwritten. And so it's not something that we're able to OCR, but we are doing, we're doing like full presentations of the images themselves with detailed abstracts. And so where we're not able to OCR, we're going in and trying to pull out keywords that will sort of enable the best possible cross search or the best possible keyword searches that we can. So with this particular case, we're working with handwritten documents. So it's at this point, it's kind of a matter of being able to see the full image in its digital form, and then being able to pull out keywords from the abstract, or in order to create abstracts using keywords that we're pulling out from the handwritten notes.
He also asked for OML, can participants add non-Roman materials? And the answer is yes. In fact, we have not only indexed a bunch of non-Roman articles from international journals, but people have also contributed with non-Roman article records as well. So yes, they can certainly add non-Roman materials to the OML, no problem. On that note, Cheryl Culier, I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name properly, asked, going forward, how will new content be added to the OML? Will it be relying heavily on crowdsourcing? If so, how does quality control work for that? The answer is yes, and we are relying on crowdsourcing, and we invite people to contribute their own preprints, their own article records, scores, videos, and it's very easy to do that currently. But we're mixing that with indexing as well. We are continuously indexing journals from all over the world. We're continuing to index a lot of the for-fee videos and content that we license every month. And particularly about the crowdsourcing data, we have some exciting projects in the roadmap. We want to engage with faculty members and researchers to create a lot of crowdsourcing tools that will allow us to, for example, link data that is openly available on Wikipedia and other sources with other digital collections. And the quality control is pretty much something that we're addressing by giving people tools as well. So rather than vet people from or vet contributions from the beginning, we're inviting people to help us moderate that. We're inviting the community to join in and to moderate the content. That is our approach there.
That's super interesting. All right, this is Mark. One last time, I think. We are just about to the end of our time today. So I'd like to take a minute to thank you, Andre, and to thank you, Jenna, for taking the time to present. Really interesting projects, I think. So thank you so much for doing that. And I'd also like to remind folks that we did record today's program. So please be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice with a link to the recording. And you should see a link to our brief 5-question survey in the chat box there. If you could take a minute to fill that out and let us know how we did, we would really appreciate it. So,
and Mark,
again,
let me just say, let's
course.
continue the conversation. Our email addresses are, they appear on your screen. So please
right here.
drop us an email with your thoughts and your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you.